Hello, and welcome to this episode of Sunflower Sutras. I'm your host, Tara. To kick things off, I would like to read Alexander Anderson's Cuddle Doon. The bairnies cuddle doon at nicht, we muckin fash and din. Oh, try and sleep, ye walk-rife rogues, your feyther's comin' in. They never heed a word I speak, I try to gie a froon. But I hap them up and cry, Oh, bairnies, cuddle doon. Wee Jamie, wee the curly heed, he aye sleeps next the wa, bangs up and cries, I want a piece. The rascal starts them and I ran and fetch them pieces, drinks, they stop a wee the soon, then draw the blankets up and cry, No, weenies, cuddle doon. But ere 5 minutes gang, wee Rab cries out, frae neath the clays, Meither Mac, tam gie hour at once, he's knittin' wi' his taes. The mischief's in that tam for tricks, he'd bother half the tune. But I hap them up and cry, Oh, bairnies, cuddle doon. At length they hear their father's fit, and as he steeks the door, they turn their faces to the wa, while Tam pretends to snore. Hey, if thee weens be good, he asks, as he pits off his shin. The bairnies, John, are in their beds, and lang sinks cuddle doon. And just afore we bed ourselves, we look at our wee lambs. Tam has his arm round wee Rab's neck, and Rab his arm round Tam's. I lift wee Jamie up the bed, and as I strike each croon, I whisper till my heart fills up, Oh, bairnies, cuddle doon. The bairnies cuddle doon at nicht, wi' mirth that's dear to me, but soon the big warls cark and care will quieten down their glee. Yet come what will to ilka end, may he who rules aboon, I whisper, through their pows be bold, Oh, bairnies, cuddle doon. Real quick before we jump into the topic for today's episode, I just want to say how adorable that poem was and how delighted I was with the result of randomly flipping through my book of quote-unquote 101 famous poems and just happening upon that. Really lucky find. I will never have luck equal to that ever again in my life. And now to get to the meat and potatoes of what today's episode is going to be. With us today is Ryan.
Hello.
And Ryan, what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about Howl by Allen Ginsberg. The reason for that is because there are a number of things related to that poem that are important within the month of October. So I figured this would be a perfect time to talk about it.
There are several points throughout the story of Howl that just have these like milestone markers in an October of whatever year it was. So I figured, there's probably no better time of the year to talk about it. And it's not just because, sodomy is spooky or something. But no, it all began, the whole story of Howl begins in an October. Specifically, the October of 1954. On the 17th of October in 1954, Allen Ginsberg goes on a massive peyote trip. And during this, he pins part 2 of Howl, the part about seeing the buildings of New York transform into the grotesque being of Moloch. And I can't imagine how that could have happened from inspiration of a peyote trip, of all things. But he gets so inspired by this piece, he can't let this piece go, and he keeps adding to it and adding to it, to the point that by mid-55, this piece has become so notorious with his friends that they would continuously egg him on to actually finalize it. And this whole time, he had like several iterations. The draft itself never changed its name, which coincidentally enough was never during this drafting period called Howl. In fact, it was called Strophes the entire time that he was writing that. I don't quite know the story behind why Strophes, is the placeholder name, but part of the reason that everyone was egging him on is that he had been commissioned of sorts to participate in what is now the notorious Six Gallery reading. That took place in October of 55, specifically October 7th of 55.
Yes. The Six Gallery reading was one of the first major public events related to the Beat movement.
Specifically the West Coast Beat movement. And
True.
That's a really fascinating thing that a lot of people don't take into consideration, because there was, not too dissimilar from like East Coast, West Coast rap for more contemporary similarity, but with beatnik stuff, a lot of it just kind of gets jumbled together. But at that time, beatniks were primarily associated with Columbia. So there was the like San Francisco Renaissance that was happening almost at the exact same time, perhaps a little bit earlier than the East Coast Columbia stuff. And funnily enough, Ginsberg jumps ship from Columbia over to San Francisco, and it's at that point that all of this happens. And this, like you were saying, was like the first major West Coast beatnik reading event.
The event actually featured readings from not only Ginsberg, but also Philip Lamontia, Michael McClure, Gary Snyder, and Philip Wallen.
And they would all become these notorious big figures in beatnik history. It's kind of funny. I've talked in a previous episode about that beatnik book that I read, The History of the Beats.
Yes.
And from all of that night, of the actual readers, most of the actual readers, it wasn't even Howell that they were the most, like, emotionally touched by. There was a piece that Lamentia did that just, like, everyone allegedly was not a dry eye in the house, is what they said. But it's Howl that lingers on in in the public opinion for reasons we'll get into.
Jack Kerouac was also there, although he didn't read, though he was the biggest cheerleader in the house that night.
I imagine that Ginsberg is just like, Kerouac-kun, please come, I need you.
Apparently he was passing around large jugs of wine throughout the audience throughout the whole night.
I wonder why it became such a ruckus household. I recall from that History of the Beats book that Ginsberg really wanted Jack to come and read because this was, as he put it, the bridging the divide between the East Coast and the West Coast. But Kerouac decided, no, I'll just, sit and support, which I don't know if you're not aware of this, my dear audience, but I'm honestly okay with Kerouac not performing.
But relating to Howl, probably the most important aspect of that night for that poem specifically and for that poem's story, a man named Lawrence Ferlinghetti was in the audience that night, who was a publisher at the time, and he was a bit of a father figure to the West Coast beat movement, and he was a publisher, and the next day he contacted Ginsberg wanting to publish Howl.
Yes, Ferlinghetti was so blown away by this gigantic piece, which if you haven't heard a person performing it as it should be performed in the Ginsberg style, every stanza is said with a single breath. So, like, by the time you get to the trickle of the last words, you're completely out of breath. You take a gigantic breath again, and then you read the next stanza. So, as lengthy as it is, it's also just this very theatrical performance. Ferlinghetti was so blown away by this performance, by this piece, because the two distinct things will come into play later between a performance and a poem. And he immediately was like, I need to get you published. And this was the beginning of his Pocket Poets series as a part of his City Lights Books publishing firm, which now has like over 100 of these little pocket books. And it's this like really notorious publishing thing. The bookstore itself that he has is actually still open, and he has like all of the books there, and it's a bucket list destination for me. But back to Howl.
The store itself became the starting point of a lot of controversy surrounding the poem. Shig Morale, the manager at the City Lights bookstore at the time, was actually arrested on June 3rd of 1957 for selling a copy of Howl to an undercover officer.
The reason why that officer was there was that it had already gained attention for specific references in the poem. Specifically, of all of the things happening in the poem, the depression and psychosis and the lingering generational anomie and all of these other like actual horrendous things that Ginsberg is tackling, of all of the things, what people took the most offense to, people in authority that is, were the references to drug use and to homosexuality. Very specifically the line, "Who let themselves be fucked in the ass by saintly motorcyclists and screamed with joy," was the specific line that led to customs officials seizing a total of 520 copies on March 25th of 57, so shortly before Shig had the altercation.
Yeah, and then shortly after Shig was arrested for selling Howl, Ferlinghetti was arrested for publishing Howl. And this led to the Howl Obscenity trial.
So now, to make things simplified, a poem was on trial for indecency. The trial itself wasn't that chaotic or asinine or even that imposing and prejudiced against Shig or Lawrence or Allen. But there were certain segments of the trial where the personalities of those involved kind of shone through.
So a couple tidbits that I really liked relating to Morale. One, when he was being held in the drunk tank when he was first arrested, they offered him a hot dog and told him that it had been laced with saltpeter in order to repress a prisoner's sexual urges. He did not eat the hot dog.
That's the funniest thing. Everything I've read throughout, like, the years of being interested in this particular story and in this particular poem, the actual legal professionals involved with the case were, for the most part, as respectful as they could for these, degenerate beatniks. But that whole degenerate beatniks thing, the actual cops involved actually treated everyone involved with this case like, get away from me, you'll give me the gay. Like, seriously though, they faced actual vandalizing from officers. Like, when they would take copies of Howl in the store, they were very haphazard with the books there, and they really they treated it like what you would see in old news footage of drug raids from the 80s. They treated this thing like it was dangerous.
Another tidbit about Morale, he was actually dismissed early and was exonerated before Lawrence, because part of the legal case against him is that he knowingly sold obscene materials. And the prosecutors were unable to prove that Morale ever actually read Howl.
This was a very interesting time in American history because America is trying to recover from a scar of things like the Comstock Act, where obscene materials were not legally allowed to be mailed and distributed. And obscene materials could be anything from apparatus for safe sex to pamphlets on safe sex and things like birth control and hygienic things even things like basic bodily hygiene could be seen as obscene if they had some kind of like diagram of certain body parts. So if that was the level of sensitivity that we were dealing with, of materials being seen as too obscene to be handled by the oh-so honorable mailing professionals of the United States of America, materials that outright had references to drug use and not coded homosexuality, this is a different time we're dealing with. I know it seems silly, but this is around the turning period, 50s turning into the 60s, and this is still the atmosphere of not just American creatives, but American intelligence and cultural knowledge. Not to go too far down the rabbit hole of things like illegal anarchist mailing of birth control, but this was a real deal. What was the name of the Hollywood thing that was like, never show a toilet and there can never be a connected bed in spouses' bedrooms? You always had to have 2 twin beds because you can't allude to the fact that a married couple has sex. Hays Code!
So the exact charges for Morale and Ferlinghetti were that they willfully and lewdly printed, published, and sold obscene and indecent writings. And the willfully part of that was also important, not just in proving that Morale knew the contents of the book and knew they were obscene. It also was important in matter of interpreting certain lines. For example, the line that Tara read earlier, in the original printing, that line was actually censored. It actually was just F ... in the A ... by saintly motorcyclists.
There's also other lines in the original poem that were censored likewise, but for different reasons. There is a line alluding to his mother in the mental hospital, but the ... is there instead. And that was just him just being like, I like this line, but I'm not ready for this line. And that actually took longer to actually get uncensored until way after all of this was resolved.
Yeah, the other censorship in the poem, they actually pretty much immediately started publishing it uncensored after they won the case. But the reason that I bring that up is because the prosecution, one of their tactics was to actually constantly ask the defense to explain what lines meant in the poem. And this is pretty easy for the defense to refute by simply saying anything that I would say is just speculation. Oh, well, it's obvious what F ... in the A ... means. No, that's speculation. You can't prove that those are bad words.
Yeah. What I really love is that, especially at this point so far, it really seems like Ginsberg himself is getting away unscathed. Because technically, under the law, he didn't commit a crime. He made an obscene art, but he's not the one who's trying to sell it. He's not the one who's trying to distribute it to the public. That's what Shig and Lawrence had to deal with, and that's why they were the ones primarily at the trial. Because they were the ones that actually got the criminal charges. The poem became such a firestorm that a year after the performance of Howl, a writer for the New York Times, Richard Eberhardt, did a scene report on the San Francisco beatniks and came across Ginsberg and Howell and wrote about it for the New York Times Book Review. He dubbed Howell, quote, the most remarkable poem of the young group, of all of those beat poets that he would interview and talk about for the New York Times. As soon as this spread by Eberhardt through the New York Times, it became a national phenomenon. And that is how people came into contact with all of this. For some people, obscenity, and for other people, revolutionary art.
And the pretty much universal acceptance and praise for this poem by artists, academics, literary critics contributed a lot to the judge's decision to deem it of redeeming social importance.
Yes. When Lawrence and Shig eventually won and everything was dropped, that's exactly what the Judge Clayton described it as.
And their exoneration in this trial was not just important for Howell and for Ginsberg, but it also paved the way for American publications of works that had already been censored and unavailable to the public, as well as bringing even more publicity to the beat movement.
So this poem was the rock star of the beat movement. This poem is the poem that everyone wants to quote or reference or make satire and parody of when they're trying to go for that, like, beatnik style, the first lines and anything sounding similar to the first lines, of course. I saw the best minds of my generation, and then you go on whatever tangent you want to go on. This is a staple of beatnik culture that is on a tier I think is similar to, like, the implicit cultural knowledge that people have of, like, Star Wars things. I've never watched Star Wars sober. I don't know Star Wars things. I know what a Jedi is, mostly. I think that Howl is on a comparable level, at least certain sections of Howl and the notoriety of Howl. This poem and the book that it's published in, which is called Howl and Other Poems, is such an important cultural icon. This poem, the book that it's published in, were carried around by people that are important to my shaping and that are important to a lot of other people's creative shapings. Jim Morrison was said to have read this poem when he was in grade school. Like, he was some kind of outsider, weirdo 8th grader who was absolutely obsessed with Howl. And Kurt Cobain was the exact same way. So it's got its lingering claws in the disenfranchised, outcast, queer shadows of America to this very day. And in fact, it still has controversy in our more contemporary times. In 1997, a Boston radio station got in trouble for doing a full broadcast of it because they didn't preface it for having mature content. So people got uppity and offended about its airing. But it aired at 6 p.m. It's not quite the normal time slot, I guess, but it's also not like it's morning either. I don't know, I'm just being defensive now. To celebrate the 50th anniversary, Ferlinghetti and a large number of other writers and artists wanted to air Howl on October 3rd of 2007 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the verdict declaring that the poem was protected under the First Amendment. The radio station WBAI of New York actually refused to air the broadcast for fear of fines from the FCC, and instead decided to play the poem on a special webcast program. Now, to be fair, the webcast program had extra special commentary from several individuals, so there's that, but 50 years later, and there was still that tail between your legs attitude. I think that's kind of hilarious. I guess it all goes to show just how deeply ingrained things like homophobia are in this country. And now for our listener submission. This next piece is from L.S. Bassan. Bassan was a 2011 Flannery O'Connor Award finalist and is a fiction editor for Prick of the Spindle. She is the author of What Suits a Nudist and Other Poems. Her play, The End of Shakespeare and Company, was the winner of the 2009 Atlantic Pacific Press Drama Prize, and she won a Mary Reinhardt Fellowship for German Sabbath, published in Summer of the Long Knives, about the successful assassination of Adolf Hitler. She's been published in many print and online publications, including Canyon Review and American Scholar. A produced and published playwright, commissioned co-author of a World War II memoir, L.S. Bassan is a native New Yorker and Vassar grad, married for 4 decades and now living in Rhode Island. You can find more information about her on her website, lsbassan.com. A section of Gertrude's letter to Hamlet, being the motive of his late alteration. Hamlet, Act 4, Scene 5.5. In the captain's quarters on the pirate ship, Hamlet discovers in his cloak a letter Gertrude had written there. Hamlet reads, "Moreover, that I have prayed to comfort your most disturbed state, and pray this sad, enforced separation necessaried by the unhappy issue of our griefs, may bear you forth to England and to health. I write this message to my beloved son, and further hope my prayers may your grace receive, and thereby such mercy as grace is known to grant those who pray. Therefore this letter was secreted in your cloak, for discovery whereupon your readiness may spare it rejection, rather vouchsafe in fair and secure reflection. The young believe most nobly, my most noble son, that they are the first who loved and felt the loss of love, the first who lived, who will be first to die, the first to taste upon their lips their own blood. But blood is liquid like water, and fits itself to the sides of this pool, where it finds its lie, or a cloud may lay its shadow thereupon, or a breeze blow, and stir it till it spills o'er its steep edge, like a waterfall of blood. Those older than the first love youth know the sways of tides, deeper for having sailed farther from land and risking distant deeps. They leave their hearts to sharks and their bones to whitely beat on strange sands where their sons may never walk. These are the risks of love when innocence means only ignorance, and all the masks and all the plays of the Alexandrine library cannot hide desire's truth. Its indifference to age. A young man's love for a maid is for her innocence, for the frail flower he will pluck. This was I to your father. He took me to his bed, a king, and me a maid, and raised me up his queen. But bring a queen to bed is something else, even for a king. Once wine is in the water, its ruddy hue colors all its flavor evermore. Claudius wanted a queen. This made him regal in my eyes. The young brother born displaced is closer to any woman than one born first. He, too, had borne the lower rank. He had worn the masks of humility and gratitude that must be the costume of the meek, though he abhor the words in their mouths more than their despising betters. He longed to gain the power of mercy, which belongs only to the powerful, and he longed for me to be merciful to him. He would not touch my hem without my nod to raise me at his crown upon his head. There is a monarch in every woman who waits for the man who thus understands her will, and she will give him what other men can only take. There is much knowledge in books of life, but it takes life to put the knowledge in the books, and life cannot be lived on paper. Your father was a man, first of war, later of naps and books, a man like Brutus, save he knew no betrayal except his own. If what you say is true, he was a soldier, saint, philosopher, but no great king. If Claudius crafted cruelty, it was a cruel carpet whose weave he was born to walk upon. And is he not a goodly king, all cold to your cousin Fortinbras, hot with his countrymen, drinking his carouse so that all dark Denmark is boisterous and bright? A king is sunshine to his state. If he obscures himself in clouds of thought, however elevated or elemental, those below know only cold and loneliness. Your father was no true guardian of the realm or of his queen. I and Denmark were widows long before his death. He left the land unplowed as if weeds were fitting garments for lovely Denmark's nakedness. Nature is no lady to be ignored. Men do so at their peril, and by deceiving themselves she deceives and hides from them willfully their proud destinies. Faith she allures to unveil privacies with grace and gentility, all slowly, so the eye can become accustomed to the strange light of greater climes. When she is ignored, nature has infinite snares to catch her trembling rabbit in. None is pretty, and all are bloody. Your father had become a man too gentle for life. I do not think he prized it well. He mused upon its end too much, and was in love, if with anything, then with death. Nature has no patience for such nonsense. She does not give a gift to have it flung back in her face as valueless. Perhaps if man groaned to begin life forth as woman does, he would not so eagerly seek to send it hence. How little we know of the source of eager motions, who so often find ourselves in motions not of our will, not in character with who we are, but who we are to be. Free will is the blind mask a merciful God puts over our faces, like actors, so we can move uncoerced. But who can say what the face of God wears alone in this celestial hall? And that is just a selected section of this wonderful piece. If you would like to know how this ends, again, her website is L.S. Bassan, that is Bassan spelled Bassen, lsbassan.com. Phenomenal. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can support us by liking us on Facebook or donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/sunflowersutras. We'd like to give a special thanks to our patrons, Poet Jen Harris, E. Campson, and Heather Aranda, for helping us keep this show running. If you or someone you know has some poetry that they would like to submit to the show, feel free to submit to us either via our Facebook, or you can submit the pieces directly to me at tara.bartley@yahoo.com. So long, gefol, and farewell.